Next up, we're going to have Mikael Lind, who's the CTO for gogoNET. And obviously with the company that's kind enough to put this whole event on, and he managed to survive Sandy and come out and hang out with us, and survive Sandy with a 1-year-old, right? So that's a pretty good feat in and within itself, so I think. So let's welcome Mikael.
Thank you. So I'm going to continue somewhat on what Silvio is talking about, like the enterprise, but I'm going to take it from the outsider's view, because I'm not an enterprise person. I've worked with IPv6 for a long, long time now, but in the ISP environment. So it's going to take my experience there and apply it to the enterprise, but starting somewhat on a very high level. We're going to go really high and see what these are the things I think you need to think of, or what you have to do. So let's start in the high level, and let's start what you need to do with your outside resources. I mean, we talked about the websites and so on. Well, you don't need to do anything if you can be 100% certain that you don't have customers that can't reach your website or that get a degraded service. Today, I don't say you can say that anymore. You're starting to get to the point when there's a bunch of people that are going to be on an IPv6 connection that is better than their IPv4 connection. And when suddenly someone up in management realizes that you're not providing an IT service that works, that's going to be your problem. So you have the choice to say, no, I'm safe, I'm not going to do anything, I'm going to sit here. But you have to be able to say that I'm 100% sure there's no one coming in, I'm not going to worry. So it's up to you to do that. And I think in the end, we're going to be at the point you have to do something. And that is, you need to get your most important external resources IPv6 enabled. So if you can say that I'm 100% certain, you have to move on and start doing your IPv6 migration on the external resources. Because we have the users, especially if you do business in Asia, they're going to have IPv6 soon, or already in some cases, but also be more or less stuck in IPv6 world, not so much just having it as an add-on, but also relying on it to get to different things. Right now, if you're a small company, I mean, a web proxy might do it. You might be able to do something like that to fix it. Most web services, as I see it, they support IPv6. So being a smaller enterprise, I mean, if you're looking at the big guys, you run Google or Facebook or something, it's a different story, because that is what you do. So you have to rely on so much else. But if you're a smaller enterprise, getting your website up might not be such a big deal. You might be able to just turn it on your web servers if you have that capability. You might be able to put a little Apache proxy in between, like we've done on our website, because we host some of it on a site that doesn't provide IPv6. So we put a little Apache server that acts as a proxy in between and takes care of the IPv6 service. And I mean, that's a possible approach you can take. And that gives you some extra breathing room to have a service running. It's somewhat separate from your full-fledged site, so you might feel a bit safer that way, because you're not really meddling around in what you have. So this is the first step to getting to IPv6. And you will still be able to show that, okay, we have a service there. We can start working on this, we can get the experience, and we're getting our feet wet and getting ready to service up the needs of the coming users. As we saw on the previous presentation, the internet is growing very rapidly, and a big chunk of those guys are going to be on IPv6, and a lot of them is going to be on IPv6-centric networks, which means they need to be able to access stuff on IPv6. They cannot always go through these layers of NATs and so on. I think there are a lot of people, different vendors that do load balancers, and I think that also something that's starting to come up a lot now, that you get these kind of functionalities in your load balancers that will allow you to turn on IPv6 on the outside and still have your IPv4 internal world for the website. So that seems like an alternative approach to take. Issues with that, I mean, if you don't go native on IPv6 on your servers, tracking. Because you're going to lose some fidelity, because if the web server doesn't understand it, well, it's not going to know what came in. I mean, you have translated it and it's going to disappear some of the information. If you go native, then your biggest concern might be security, because you have to figure out how to do that on IPv6 at the same time. So you have a bit of a trade-off there for the early steps. But I think medium-sized and smaller enterprises, it's perfectly doable, and it's not that difficult to get yourself up and running in this. Just having it on the website is not all. I mean, if you're going to deal with customers that are on IPv6, you have to consider other stuff as well. And you got your email and DNS, I guess, are the most basic pieces to that puzzle. There might be other services as well, depending on what you do. But these are the two you have to consider, at least, to include in this package of things you have to start out with. Not as easy, perhaps, as doing your website. I mean, depending on the complexity of the website, of course. But considering a basic website, this might be a bit more tricky. You could upgrade your DNS servers to do a v6. I mean, most of the software out there does support it today. So, I mean, if you're fairly up to date on what you're running, you should be okay. We come back to, I mean, you have the security issues and so on to make sure everything is synced up on that. You could go the alternative of putting up a separate world for IPv6. But then you always have the risk to make sure everything is synced up, so you suddenly don't service up something completely different in that world, and you get out of sync. So, I mean, has some trade-offs here as well. Email, you might want to at least be able to receive email on IPv6. And, I mean, that could be fairly easy with having an incoming server that can take IPv6. But if your email system doesn't support IPv6, I mean, it's going to be harder to get emails out again. So I think that's going to be a very tricky one to work on. I'm going to be a part of your more long-term project, but it's something that has to be done. As part of that, I mean, we run into the firewall, or really the security issues, excuse me, related to this. And you mean you have to get this into the package as well. Oh, I guess there is no water here. And that's why, I mean, in some cases I can see a lot of people see a benefit of separating all the new stuff into a new world. So you can start doing it now and playing with it, because I think that is getting out there and getting going, and that's where you're going to learn. And that's where you have the time to build up your whole infrastructure around it. If we say attention to the inside, to your internal users in the network, you get to the same kind of question. What do you need to do? Oh, you don't need to do anything. I mean, it's working. You have your file service, you have your services, everything's running. So you don't need to do anything, except if you suddenly have users that need to communicate with external users, or you have your client somewhere that's running something IPv6, and so suddenly you have the situation where someone is like screaming, oh, I need connectivity now, fix it. So I think that is where you have to take into account. I mean, can you really be sure that you're not going to run into that situation fairly soon, where you need to provide some sort of connectivity for your users to get to your customers outside and interact with them on IPv6. Oh, perfect. Thank you. And as we had heard before, I mean, several times, is at least what you have to do now, you need to develop a plan. You need to be prepared. You have to know what you're going to do, so you're not panicking when you get to the point when someone comes and says, we need this. We need it tomorrow because we're working on this new project. I think the path forward should be towards an IPv6-centric network. And what I mean with that is that you want to design around IPv6 eventually and build things based on that, because you want to be able to get rid of IPv4 eventually. So if you start building on an IPv6-centric thinking, I think you can make the most use of this migration, because you don't want to just do it because you have to. You want to be able to use the extra features that's there. I think Sylvia mentioned it quite nicely in the sense that you can do a lot with IPv6, but that means you have to plan for that. Otherwise, it's not going to be anything. And eventually, you need to roll out some sort of IPv6 support. That could be just an internal tunneling service to help to just get people connected and be able to connect to the outside and do stuff. So if we dive down a little bit from this like super high level look at IPv6 and the enterprise, I want to look a bit on the different deployment approaches inside the network that I see are possible. And I somewhat base this on what I see in like you could do in the ISP world when it comes to like broadband solutions and so on. Difference is the enterprise world is managed, so you have more control over devices and so on. You know somewhat what's running in your network. If you're an ISP or a broadband provider, you have no idea what your customer is going to run. So you have to provide a service that covers all, more or less. You have to provide IPv4, and soon you have to provide IPv6 as well, but you cannot ever, more or less, drop IPv4 because you don't know. People are going to have like Xboxes and other stuff at home that's going to require an old connection. It's going to require IPv4. In an enterprise environment, it is a bit different because you have a better view on what's actually in your network and what's actually running and what kind of applications are running. At least, hopefully, you have a clue of what's going on in the network. And that can help you do things a bit differently than you could do otherwise. Otherwise, when you face the same challenges, it is the same in the sense that if you're a big enterprise, you're going to have all kinds of different users. You're going to have external users. So even if everything you run internally is IPv6 enabled, you're going to have guest users that are going to require IPv4 access. So maybe your guest Wi-Fi network needs to support IPv4 and IPv6, while your internal network can be IPv6 only. But you have to take into account the full support for every kinds of applications and devices. And that makes it very similar to what an ISP has to deal with. A small player is a bit different. You could like shrink it down and you can say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we skip all the rest. So what you're at the early stage, as I said, you need to at least have something to provide IPv6 to a limited set of users. So it could be a group within the company that needs IPv6 in their network, or it could be a single user that needs IPv6. So you need to be able to do that. At the same time, these guys might need to be able to run IPv6 even when they're external, to be able to get into your network and do whatever they need on IPv6. So if we take the first approach, I think is possible. Like the first step what you can do today to get this running is deploying IPv6 internally using some sort of tunneling service. So your infrastructure stays the same. You provide the specific service to those users who need it, or to that group of people that need it. So you enable those local networks or segments to have IPv6 access to interact with their customers or whatever they're doing that requires IPv6. This, allows you to act much faster than if you would have to, wait to do a full rollout of IPv6 in your whole network and have the whole, everything ready for IPv6. It gives you a quick start to get into offering the service needed. Of course, you could use tunneling for providing it to almost everybody in your network, but in the long run, that doesn't really make sense. But it gives you the option of getting things going and getting things out there. So if you look at it, more or less, you could have your network as is, and you add IPv6 support in well, that's where you host your service and have the connectivity to the outside, and then you just provide it to the limited set of users internally. And this is also very likely you would have to have some external access to your network that is IPv6 enabled. So if you have your VPN service, if you can have it on that one, but you have to have some way of letting people work remotely as well as internally on IPv6. So I think that would be like your first step into the IPv6 migration to get it going now. If you haven't done things already and gotten quite far down the road on IPv6 deployment, I think you're going to have to end up in this kind of step because you're not going to have all the equipment and everything in place to do a complete switch to IPv6. Next step might be that you're going for a dual stack network, and it might be it's an option already for you today. If you're a small player, you have a small network and it's all switched, sure, you could enable it and you apply the same security rules you do on IPv6 as IPv4 and so on. But if you're a bit of a bigger network, it's going to be complex to go to a dual stack network. The good thing of having, you have the full access on both. It's going to work nicely on both protocols. Downside, as I see it, is you're stuck running two networks forever. And having this, two-network approach, not only have you to run both networks, you also have to squeeze IPv6 into IPv4 infrastructure. So you cannot really make use of all the benefits of IPv6 because you have to adapt it to fit somewhat your structure that you're using for IPv4. If you would go completely IPv6 as the base, you could do a different approach on how you use IPv6, I think. And you still, if you run still your IPv4 network, you still have the same issues. You still have to maintain everything on IPv4. You're going to have the address management issues. You're going to have the address shortage issues because it's still going to be out there all over the place. Sure, not all devices might be using it, but it's still going to be there. So you have to set it up in the same way you're doing today. So you're not gaining that much in the long run. Short term, it's probably the best approach, but in the long run, I think you want to move into something that is more IPv6 centric. So, this is fairly easy. There's nothing to it really. You have your network that is dual stack. You might need to provide some external access for IPv6 because you don't know if you have it externally or not. So you make sure your VPN connections or something supports dual stack, so you can work the same way externally as internally. The approach that I prefer in the long run, at least, is more of a IPv6 based approach. So you focus your build out or your upgrades around IPv6 and what you can do with IPv6. So you want to make sure that you plan, as we've heard before, you want to plan around IPv6 and the benefits of it. You can use the addressing in completely different ways. You can build your security a bit differently and so on. But that requires you to break it apart. If you're going to mix it up, it's not going to be as easy to do this. And a big key factor here is that this is a managed environment. You control the devices. You don't have to provide legacy support if you don't want to. You might have to do it for certain specific things, but in general, you can control. You can make sure your computer's updated. They're running the new operating systems that support IPv6, and you have the software in there that runs, or all the apps that run IPv6. So you have the chance of doing this. So that's, I think, is the biggest difference between an ISP and an enterprise. In an enterprise, you can actually go to a more of an IPv6-based infrastructure, whilst an ISP, you're stuck running both for a very, very long time because you have to have some sort of legacy service. For the customer, it has to be both. While a customer in an enterprise or a user in an enterprise could have just an IPv6 only service. Of course, today, you have to have something to get out on the internet. You need to be able to surf the web. But you can solve that in different ways. You can have a proxy service that takes you out to the internet or something like that. And for specific services, you can run IPv4 on top of IPv6. In the same way you would run IPv6 on top of IPv4 today, you can do the reverse in the future. And if you plan for the long run, I think that gives you a way of scaling down your your work on having IPv4 resources and spending money on IPv4 as it's going down. It allows you to slowly but surely phase it out and get into an environment that is built all around IPv6. And I mean, this might be a view I have based on having worked with IPv6 a bit too long, but I think this is the long-term approach you want to look at. At least you want to have it in the back of your head that this is what you want to make use of. You want to try to make the most out of this migration and plan it in that way so you can get at this point. On the external side, I mean, we still need to service out both because you don't know where people are coming. It's the same way we're in the reverse right now. You don't know if people are going to have IPv4 for a very long time and be stuck in it. Probably they will. So you need to be able to service up your external stuff on IPv4 just as well as on IPv6. Applications, that's usually where you need to have this legacy service internally, because it's not usually that the user's operating system or laptop or whatever requires IPv4 to run, but you have your old accounting software. That's going to stay there, and you're not going to change it that easily. You're usually stuck for that for a very, very long time. And that's where you have to do something, a workaround to get IPv4 support. So in this case, you might end up with almost all your network being IPv6 only, and just your server side will be dual stack. So your connection to the outside world is dual stack. You get that there. You have all your external facing servers dual stacked. You have some sort of service that allows you to tunnel IPv4 over IPv6 for the internal network, but also have some kind of service for external IPv4 access for like the basic stuff like the web servers and so on. But that's, as I said, you could do that with a proxy, which a lot of people use anyway for the web traffic. And this allows you to slowly but surely phase out IPv4 and do a network that is optimized for IPv6. And that I think would be the thing that is the long-term plan for how to do it. At least that is my take as not being an enterprise IT manager, except for perhaps running Freenet 6, if that counts. I don't know, not really, but still. Try to think of it as something you want to optimize building around IPv6, and I think in the long run it's going to save you money. That's it. Thank you.